Okay, let's see our attendee list here. I think people are coming in. There we go. All right. I see. Oh yeah, several people. Hi, Eric, and another Eric, who's often on. Rachel, you're often on. Thank you for coming. I'm going to give another couple seconds. We have 88 people registered. Just a handful are in right now, and in general, people don't get all the way logged on for 5 minutes or so. But I'll do my little welcome. That'll take up a little time. Um, Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the lab's webinar. I was going to say series, but it's more than a series. It's a lifestyle, really. This one we're presenting today after being off for the summer is going to be started off by my colleague Shelby Ketchum, who for us is leaving in 2 weeks, but he's been a great co-worker. He's going to go live in Germany and become more educated. But today he's going to tell us all about financing and incentives for energy efficiency, navigating the new landscape post-IRA changes. That's been his specialty while he's been here at Seattle City Light. And he has some great contacts at KBKG, and Jesse Stanley and Mike Cornell are here with us. We had them on KBKG last year or the year before to give us sort of a deep dive. There are experts. So let's get started. If you have not had a webinar with the Lighting Design Lab before, we keep you all on mute the whole time, but definitely find that questions icon. It's a little like text speech bubble with a question mark in it. Click on that. You can enter in your question at any time. I will be monitoring them and I'll interrupt as necessary. If you have taken a webinar, you know I like to interrupt. This is being recorded, so if you have to step away or if afterwards you want to revisit it or share it with your friends, we'll post this on our website within about a week. And at the very end, as you exit, a web browser, a window pops up and there's a little survey. We very much appreciate when you fill that out and give us some feedback on what you want to hear next. Really quick, the Lighting Design Lab has been around for decades and decades. Started with lighting, education, resources, but we've expanded to include all things electrification, decarbonization, building performance. And we do have a new name. I will not reveal it at this point. It's not, it's exciting if you've been with us. We finally have a new name. Okay, and our upcoming events, we have a heat pump water heater installation capabilities and business growth opportunities on October 7th. It's an early one at 7:30. It's really more for small commercial installers, contractors, but it will provide also just some general overview of those heat pump water heaters if you want to attend that. And then we have a very cool opportunity on October 16th. Dwayne from Department of Construction and Inspections is going to host a 4-hour in-person training specifically on multifamily energy code, which was actually, we set this up on a suggestion that somebody entered at the end of class survey. So really we do read those and take those to heart, and that's free. We're going to have little breakfast snacks and some products too. If you've heard of Efoca, what was the window one, Robert? Gradient is going to be there. I can't remember where there's a triple pane window, cool technology, thin pane. Anyway, that's kind of a preview of what's coming up this fall. And without further ado, Shelby, are you ready for your presentation? Uh-oh, I can't hear you again. Are you muted? Oh, yeah, you are.
No, I was just muted, but yes, I'm ready.
There
Thank
we
you.
go. Phew. All right, thank you, everybody. And here we go with Shelby.
Can we go to the first slide, please? Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Shelby Ketchum, and I'm the Inflation Reduction Act Specialist here at Seattle City Lights. And if we go to the next slide, Katie, I want to start this conversation with a little bit of an overview of what was the IRA, what was accomplished, and the big changes. First, to start with the big changes, I think most people on this call today probably are aware that in July, President Trump signed the Big Beautiful Bill Act, which changes a lot of things across the federal government, but in particular for this conversation, drastically impacts the incentives for clean energy products and clean energy production that were passed in the Inflation Reduction Act under the last administration. Some of the big cuts are going to be to the EV tax credits, uh, the building renovation credits, and clean energy like solar and wind. There's new compliance barriers, particularly around anti-China barriers that fall under new foreign entities of concern rules. There's been grant recessions, basically pulling back some of the funding that had been allocated to the IR from to departments like DOE and the EPA, and then shorter timelines for some of the clean energy credits. Next slide, please. But big picture, what survived and what didn't. What survived? Credits for energy storage, geothermal, and advanced manufacturing. So um, things advanced manufacturing like solar batteries, those kind of at the factory level survived, and so did the direct pay mechanism and transferability of those credits, which we're going to dive into. What didn't survive is grid scale wind and solar, residential clean energy, building renovation credits, and most of the EV components. Next slide, one. Outside of the direct incentives provided for the in the IRA, there was also about $145 billion worth of grants that were to be administered by departments like DOE, EPA, HUD, and so forth. The Biden administration was able to get out about $97 billion before January 20th. That left about 31 billion the Big Beautiful Bill rescinds, so that money that was not spent will not be spent going forward. And of course, if anyone's been following the news, there is some concentration around the grants that were in that 97, but they're still working their way through the courts. But overall, it's great that almost $100 billion has been spent in the last 3 years for clean energy projects. Next slide, please. One of the ones that I wanted to highlight is going to be the IRA rebate program. This is a program, or it was a $9 billion fund from the IRA that provided seed funding for states to launch home electrification rebate programs. Washington State received about $200 million, and that program is still going forward. Just, I think it was about a week or two ago, Department of Commerce announced the implementer and for the rebate program here in the state, and they're hoping for an early 2026 pilot launch. Next slide, please. This next slide is going to cover some of the equipment that is going to be covered in that rebate program. Excuse me. That rebate program, like I said, is administered by the state. It's going to provide direct incentives for low-income households in both single-family and multifamily buildings to do all-electric renovations, whether heat pumps, induction stoves, weather sealing, all those great things. That program is still going forward. Next one, please. And then lastly, kind of just looking forward, before I can hand this off to KG to talk about the more details of this. Like I said, the IRA Home Rebate Program, that has spurred Washington State to launch its very first statewide rebate program. It is really kind of kicking the state in to take more of an active role in incentivizing residential conversions and residential renovations. Clean energy manufacturing like solar, wind, and batteries has seen just a huge boom over the last several years. All types of new factories across the state or across the country are still going forward. And we saw that those advanced manufacturing credits survived. So that is some possibility of still continuing. Advanced geothermal, nuclear, and biofuels, the subsidies for those survived, and while the ones for solar and wind did not, the overall structure of the credit survived. So you can imagine a future Congress simply just adding those back in, fingers crossed down the road. And then, regardless of the incentives and the lack of the incentives, all research indicates that going forward, wind and solar are still going to be the majority of new generation added to the national grid. So while those incentives aren't there, the momentum is still there. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to some of the experts to be able to provide much more detail than I can. And I see Mike, you're up. So with that, I'm going to go
Real
ahead and
quick though, Shelby,
yes,
I'm gonna interrupt you
yeah,
before
please.
you can go get some water. Um, eh, Eric wanted to know, he said geothermal survived. So what's in that? Do you have any information you can speak to on what the geothermal requirements are?
Um, Very broadly, I think it's there's a production and investment tax credits for clean energy production. They basically just said wind and solar don't qualify for those, but geothermal does. So things like advanced geothermal, where they're using new kind of drilling technologies or even traditional geothermal still survive. But I think Mike probably knows a lot more about this, the nitty gritty details of this than I do.
Great.
Any
Okay,
other
I will let
questions?
Mike take that away. Nope, that's all the questions right now.
Great.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Shelby, and thank you, Katie. If we want to go ahead to the next slide. So my name is Mike Cornell. I'm a director with KBKG. And in a little bit, I'll be handing it off to Jesse Stanley, who's one of our principals that will be talking as well. Want to start off with a little bit about KBKG. Our company was established in 1999. We have offices in the major markets throughout the U.S., Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, uh, Dallas, New York. And so we're one of the oldest and largest independent providers of specialty tax studies in the country. We focus exclusively on value-added tax services. We're not a CPA firm. We help CPA firms with a lot of these, whether it's cost segregation or research and development tax credits, and then a lot of these kind of specialty credits around uh, energy efficiency and other projects, green building tax incentives, things like that. So that's our focus. If we move to the next slide, please. Again, we have, like I said, we have offices in several offices in the Los Angeles area, Atlanta, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston, New York, and Chicago, with some satellite offices up in the Northwest in Spokane, and even kind of closer down into Florida. So if we can move on to the next. So in a minute, I'll be handing it off to colleague Jesse Stanley, who's a principal in our green building tax incentives practice. He's our 179D practice leader and has over 17 years of engineering and tax industry experience. He is a licensed professional engineer in 38 states and has a 179D project portfolio of over 2 billion square feet. He is an AIA member and an ASHRAE member and a AIA continuing education provider for the A&E industry, and has previously presented 179D matters to former congressmen, federal agencies, and state government officials. Next, please. Again, my name is Mike Cornell. I am, oh, that's not updated. I'm a director in the Texas office. I'm a member of the American Society of Cost Segregation Professionals. I have over 25 years in cost segregation, over 10 years experience with the big four CPA firms, and have worked on in just about every industry from manufacturing to retail to hospitality. and have also now been working with our group to help clients with their credits and incentives around some of these solar and wind and geothermal projects. So if you can move forward. I wanted to get a little bit, I guess just go back on the geothermal. We actually haven't done a whole lot of geothermal. Most of the projects that we have worked on are wind and solar. But most of what we've seen with geothermal is, systems that are used for heating and cooling systems for the building. I've worked in the past on geothermal systems for power generation, but those tend to be big industrial type applications. So I think I'm not as current on what survived in terms of geothermal because, like I said, we haven't done a whole lot of that. But I think it's the systems that are used on a more on a smaller basis for things like building heating and cooling systems. But we'll have to look into that a little bit more. So what I wanted to talk about today was, thinking back to the Inflation Reduction Act, it was trying to incentivize a wide range of organizations, whether for-profit or not-for-profit, state or local governments, in an effort to kind of cast a broad net to accelerate the initiative for clean energy adoption here in the U.S. And that was really highlighted by two key provisions that were included in the Act that allow for the monetization of clean energy credits. And so what I want to focus the conversation for a little bit is that, because that's one of the hot topics right now from a tax planning perspective. So the first is Code Section 6417. And that allows applicable entities such as tax exempt organizations to apply for direct payment refund from the government with respect to investments in their qualifying clean energy projects. And those provisions offered tax exempt entities which traditionally couldn't fully benefit from clean energy tax credits to take advantage of those incentives by just requesting a direct payment refund from the government for the investment in those projects. So that's what I'm going to spend the next couple of slides really kind of focusing on that, outlining the common credits that we see in practice, as well as the procedures for claiming those direct pay refunds. The second provision was Code Section 6418, and that allows certain eligible taxpayers to choose to transfer or sell all or a portion of their eligible credits to an unrelated taxpayer for cash payments. And so that could obviously help them if they were in a tax situation where they couldn't utilize those credits, they could still get some money for them. So if we want to move on to the next slide, please. So there are several energy credits that are eligible for monetization, and this chart shows the common renewable energy credits that we have seen in practice, as well as the impact on those credits under the One Big Beautiful Bill. So Section 48 credits are phasing out now, as they had to be under construction by the end of 2024, and they've been replaced by 48E investment credits and 45Y production credits. And one important note is that you must elect one or the other. You can't claim an investment credit and a production credit on the same property. And the big change for all of these credits is the date in which they start to phase out. So for wind and solar projects that start construction prior to July 4th of 2026, they have 4 years to be completed and placed in service. For projects that start after July 4th of 2026, they have to be placed in service prior to the end of 2027. So, the deadline there is 12/31 of 27 to get those into service. There's no change on the dates for the energy storage or the geothermal or the nuclear projects. So you don't have to worry about those in terms of dates. For EV charger credits and commercial clean vehicles, the change again, it's the dates of the phase out. So the EV chargers, they've got to be in service by June of next year, the end of June of next year. And clean vehicles must be in service by September 30th of this year. So those obviously go away much, much quicker. Slide 3, or the next slide, please. So to go a little deeper into the timeline phase out of the OBBBA, let's look more closely at the concept of when construction begins. So because when a wind or solar project must be placed in service depends on whether construction has started prior to July 4th, 2026. Notice 2025-42 was issued in August, and it provides a safe harbor for projects with a nameplate capacity of less than 1.5 megawatts, and that safe harbor is 5%. So construction is said to have begun once 5% of the cost of the project has been incurred. Now that's for smaller projects less than 1.5 megawatts. For projects over 1.5 megawatts, they'll have to rely on the physical work of a significant nature test. And that's typically considered to be 10% of the cost of the project. If you look at guidance from years past, 10% was usually the threshold that was considered, and it has to be physical work. It's not just permitting and planning and financing and all of the things that have to happen up to you actually start moving dirt. It's the physical work that has to be done. So those are some things that you've got to watch to make sure that you're getting things done on time, getting in before deadlines so that you can take the most advantage of these credits as you can. And there's also going to be new restrictions based on the foreign entities of concern. So like, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, designated terrorist organizations, those kinds of things. And projects cannot receive material assistance from companies that are owned or controlled by these designated entities. The IRS is still generating guidelines to help with, the determination of that, but that is going to be something that will have to be considered as you start looking at whether you can qualify for these credits. And again, the transferability and the direct pay options were not impacted at all. So that's a nice thing. Next slide, please. All right. So one of the biggest beneficiaries of the IRA is the non-tax paying community when it comes to the monetization of these renewable credits because of the refundability aspects that are now available. And so that new mechanism was called the tax credit direct pay or elective pay. And those rules apply to a wide range of tax exempt organizations. So anything set up as a 501 to 530, the tax code typically are considered applicable entities. And the state and local governments, that's where I think we have the biggest opportunity, as this captures the full hierarchy of state and local governments. I mean, it could be the state level, the county level, school districts, police departments, again, really in an effort to cast this broad net around government agencies and organizations that might be investing in clean energy technologies, but couldn't take advantage of the tax credits before. So one of the more detailed aspects, though, is that the energy property needs to be held directly by the tax exempt entity. And I mention that because there are times where tax exempt organizations need to go into a partnership structure for whatever reason. And maybe that entity or that partnership is going to make the purchase of the energy property. And typically in that scenario, they are not eligible for the direct pay option. It has to be the tax exempt organization that owns the property. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so finally, I want to kind of briefly discuss the process of electing for a direct payment. And so it's easy to kind of think of it in three separate buckets. So the first, you need to have a qualifying investment in clean energy, obviously. So investment in solar, wind, the EV charging stations, whatever. We need to determine what is your qualified project or projects. Then you need to determine when that project is going to be placed into service for tax purposes. And again, this notion of placed in service is true for many other tax provisions, and really there's no official definition of how to determine when an asset is placed in service. But generally speaking, when that property is ready for its intended use is a good rule of thumb for when property is ready to be placed in service, and when those underlying credits can then be triggered and can claim a refund. So in order to claim the credit, you need to go through a process where the organization needs to pre-register these credits. And this pre-registration process is a way for the government to track how much funding is going into these clean energy projects, the amount of credits generated, and most importantly, to kind of help reduce fraud or duplication of the credits. We've gone through this process, this pre-registration process with a few clients, and it's an intuitive process. There's a thorough user guide that the IRS has put out there that outlines how to navigate the system. It's probably one of the most useful documents I've ever seen from the IRS, and so it really helps walk you through the process, and it spells it out pretty easily. And then this registration process is going to result in each specific project having a unique ID. And so at one point, each project will have its own registration number, its own registration ID. So let's say you have a solar project and a geothermal project and a wind project that are all performed and placed in service in the same tax year, and maybe even installed by the same manufacturer. Each one of those is going to have a separate registration ID. So once an organization gets approved and receives a registration ID, then they have to file a Form 990T. That form's been around for many years, but for a lot of state and local governments, it's going to be a new requirement that they're not familiar with because they've never filed anything like a tax return for the organization. And those 990Ts will have supplemental schedules that need to be attached. So, for example, if you're claiming the investment tax credit, you'll need to complete a Form 3468, which has all the qualifying energy property specifics. And that form ultimately gets rolled up into a general business credit form 3800. So, the biggest question that we always get from state and local governments is, I've never had to file a Form 990T or really anything. Do I actually need to file anything? We don't file a return. And the answer is yeah, it's a requirement in order to make a valid election to get that refund. So the state and local government can actually choose to either be a calendar year taxpayer or a fiscal year, and that will determine when the Form 990T needs to be filed. So for instance, a city government would likely choose to be a calendar year filer, but a school district would likely elect a fiscal year that conforms more closely to the school calendar. And we've helped lots of organizations with those forms, getting them filled out, making sure they're filled out correctly and filed in a timely manner. And then I also need to address the concept of double dipping. So part of what we do when we work with tax exempt organizations is to understand the funding sources for these clean energy projects. There are limitations that will reduce the credit if 100% of the projects are funded from tax exempt grants. An example might be if you're a school district and you receive $1 million grant to install solar panels on the school, and that the solar panel contract was for $1 million. Well, the IRS have put in caveats that's going to reduce or outright eliminate the eligible credit amount. So what we want to look out for is if the grant amount plus the credit amount is greater than the investment in the energy property, then you're going to have to reduce your credit dollar for dollar. Now, if a grant is specifically earmarked for a type of energy project, then we may run into that issue. But if funding is from a general fund and you can spend those dollars on any capital projects you choose, then you're probably going to be okay. So, I wanted to note that because it is something that you have to look at. And there will be some additional time that consultants will spend in terms of reviewing grant applications and the funding arrangements and making sure that everything is on the up and up, and that you can satisfy all the requirements that you have to be able to qualify for those credits. So that's what I have on those. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jesse to talk a little bit more about additional credits and incentives.
And actually, Mike, we had a question real quick
Mhm.
before you hop on, Jesse. It's a couple of parts.
Oh
So
boy.
I'll go slow.
Yeah.
Philip was wondering regarding FEOC, it stated after July 4th, 2025. Does
Right.
that mean that one would need to have acquired their equipment prior to that date in order to avoid FEOC requirements for a 2025 project?
That is a good question. I think it's for, yeah, I know that obviously anything that was, I think it's for even if construction was started prior to that, I think you're fine.
Okay,
I
let
don't
me
know
give
that
you a
we've seen the final the final guidance on that yet.
Okay, so maybe you don't know this. They have a specific instance that they're talking about. They were hoping to install a commercial solar project on their building by purchasing and hopefully receiving solar hardware in Q4 this year in order to
Okay.
install in 2026 using safe harbor to lock in 2025 tax credits without FEOC restrictions. Is that incorrect or correct-ish, or we don't know yet?
I am not positive yet.
Yeah.
I haven't seen guidance on that particular uh, that aspect of it, and so I don't know. I think the general consensus is as long as you've started before that date, you're grandfathered into the old rules. But at this point, I'd hate to say for sure,
Philip,
and
both
until we
both
get
these
final
guys,
guidance.
yeah, both these guys' emails are on this slide deck, so reach out to them absolutely after this. After our
Yeah,
last presentation, several people did, and were helped by you guys quite a lot, it sounded like.
yeah, absolutely. Feel to send that question directly, and I'll do a little more research, uh, and hopefully even have you know the actual guidance and the what we have from the the regulations that we can show this is what it says. So this is the interpretation that we have, rather than just kind of me speaking off the top of my head. But I think I think right now we're still waiting on final guidance to
Great.
really know for
Okay.
sure.
All right. Thank you, Mike, for your part of the presentation. Jesse, are you ready to continue on?
I am, yes. Thank you, Mike. Perfect. And if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide, that'd be great. So the next thing that we're going to be talking about is the 179 capital D tax deduction. So this is the energy efficient commercial building tax deduction. And we'll start with a brief history of kind of what it has looked like over the years and then what it looks like today. So 179D was enacted all the way back in 2005 as part of the Energy Policy Act. Initially, at its inception, it was a form of accelerated depreciation for commercial building owners only. So if you're a private for-profit building owner, you're building a building or you're renovating a building, there existed a tax deduction if that building was hitting a certain level of energy efficiency. And that still exists for commercial building owners that are either building new construction buildings or doing major renovations. In 2008, the financial crisis occurred, and all of a sudden, construction came to kind of a screeching halt across the US. Congress was looking at the situation, assessing that 25% of architects in Chicago were unemployed. The single largest owner of buildings in America was the federal government, between federal, state, and local government buildings. So they looked at 179D and modified it significantly to allow government-owned buildings to pass their tax deductions along to the designers of their buildings. So architecture firms, engineering firms now could receive a tax deduction for working on and designing a federal, state, or local government project. Both of these incentives for commercial building owners and for the designers of government-owned buildings were temporary in nature, but they were extended with bipartisan support repeatedly up until 2020 when it was made permanent. And then in 2022, it receives a pretty significant expansion in the Inflation Reduction Act. This involved an expansion to include nonprofit buildings. So now all of a sudden, private schools, private universities, religious buildings, and all other types of nonprofits could also allocate tax deductions to the designers of their buildings. Additionally, the benefit was increased from $1.80 per square foot to $5 per square foot maximum. And each of these have inflation adjustments that are added per year, given its permanency that was introduced in 2020. Okay, next slide.
Real quick, I have a question. It's maybe ahead of time. Devin was wondering if a public entity gets a state grant to pay for 100% of rooftop solar program and includes as part of the project a new roof and pays for the roof out of general funds, can they still get the tax credit?
Yeah, so great question. So, and we will cover this in a little bit more detail, but if it is if the owner of that piece of property, in this instance, it would be the roof that would be eligible, they can allocate a tax deduction for 179D to one of the designers of that system. So the solar panels themselves would not be eligible equipment. It would have to be the building envelope equipment. So in this instance, the roof would meet that description, or it could be new glazing systems, new insulation. The other two categories are new HVAC systems, so heating and cooling equipment in the building. And the third category is lighting equipment. So if a government entity is the owner of that equipment, is paying for that equipment to be installed, it doesn't really matter where the funding source comes from for the nonprofit or the government entity, as long as they're the ones that are paying for that equipment. They can then pass that deduction along to the architect or the engineer that designed that system. It's not a tax credit, it's a tax deduction. And there is no way for the nonprofit or the government owner to directly take advantage of that incentive. But great question. All right, and so if we go to the next slide. So what we talked about was the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022 really expanded 179D in several ways, which we'll dive into. And then the One Big Beautiful Bill was signed into law on the 4th of July, and it introduced a sunset to 179D. This sunset begins on property that the last day to start construction to still be eligible to pursue 179D is June 30th of 2026. So what that means is if you break ground on your project and begin building it, June 25th of next year, even if that property takes 4 years to be built, it can still pursue 179D. But if you start construction, you begin building that property July 10th of next year, you've missed that cutoff and you can no longer pursue 179D for that property. For commercial building owners, there is significant flexibility here to look backwards on missed deductions. If you've renovated or built a building over the last 5, 6, 7 years, there's a high likelihood that you can still claim 179D on that building. For engineering firms, architecture firms, we're limited to your window of amendment of your tax return. So generally speaking, if you designed a property that was put into service in 2022, there's a high likelihood that we can go back and get those deductions for that project today. And as we mentioned, you've got a window into the future based on how long that construction takes. So in this graphic, you can see that if construction starts middle of next year, most K-12 projects have a 24-month average construction time, which would mean that that's finishing in 2028 and going on to a tax return as a deduction in 2029. Larger projects or federal projects have even longer horizons for construction. So those could be finishing in 2029 or later. So for most engineering firms or architecture firms, we have potentially 8 or more tax years available of projects to be thinking about for 179D. So there is a shutoff that the One Big Beautiful Bill introduced, but there's still a very large ramp of opportunity forward, as well as possibilities to look backwards in past tax years to find significant deductions. All right, next slide. Okay, so how much is this benefit? So up until 2022, before the Inflation Reduction Act, it was generally up to $1.80 per square foot. So a 100,000 square foot building could generate a $180,000 tax deduction. For those of you that are not too familiar with what a tax deduction is, you can easily think about this to say a $100,000 tax deduction, if you're at a 35% effective tax rate, is going to feel like about $35,000 of cash savings to your business because you can multiply it by your effective tax rate. And that's roughly what the cash value is going to feel like as a taxpayer. So 2020 and prior, maximum was $1.90. There were partial qualifying pathways of 60-cent thresholds if a building didn't hit that 50% energy cost savings. And there was also a rule to allow parking garage structures and lighting renovations to have access to deductions as well. All right, next slide. So the Inflation Reduction Act removed the partial qualifying pathways, also removed the interim lighting rule altogether, and lowered the threshold. So now, instead of the max benefit happening at 50% energy cost savings and much lower benefit at numbers below that energy cost savings, it's now a sliding scale of benefit from 25% energy cost savings up to that 50%. And as you can see, in 2025, we're now talking about $5.81 per square foot as a maximum benefit for those projects. So this is much more effective and much more valuable to taxpayers and commercial building owners that are building new construction or renovating their projects. Next slide. Okay, so this slide sums up what the Inflation Reduction Act did. It said, okay, let's fix a hole that existed around nonprofits. So now nonprofit owned buildings can also allocate deductions just like government owned buildings. It also introduced the importance of prevailing wages. So prevailing wage and apprenticeships are tied to that larger $5 benefit. If you're paying prevailing wages and apprentices, you have the ability to get $2.50 to $5 per square foot. If you are not, the benefit is limited to 50 cents to $1. There is, however, a safe harbor that exists, so you can be grandfathered into getting the larger benefit amounts, regardless of how you paid your construction teams, as long as you started building your building prior to January 29th of 2023. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. And then again, the last change here is the dollar amount became much more attractive, going from $1.88 maximum in 22 to north of $5 per square foot in 2023 and later. All right, next slide. I've mentioned this comment about a government entity or a nonprofit being able to allocate a tax deduction. This is a unique mechanism where the government or the nonprofit chooses one of their designers, be it the architecture firm, engineering firm, mechanical engineer, electrical engineer, design build contractor, and decides we're going to give the deduction to this party. Now, it is typically first come, first serve. So what that means is if you're an architecture firm or an engineering firm and you have a 170 provider in place, you can pursue this and hopefully get an allocation letter for your property and secure that benefit. The second or third to act designers very often will miss out on the benefit altogether because it already went to the person that moved the quickest to secure that benefit. They can be shared amongst multiple designers if they're coordinating ahead of time and there's agreement that they would like to split the benefit. However, ultimately, it is the decision of the government owner or the nonprofit owner who they want to give the allocation to and if they want to allocate at all. This is something that's available for past projects as well as something to consider for future projects. It's a unique, essentially a race that exists for these benefits. Private owners of buildings, they cannot allocate the deduction. It is exclusively theirs if they want it. They cannot pass it to someone else. Okay, next slide.
Real quick, we have a couple clarifying questions.
Yeah.
Does 179D apply to commercial and residential projects?
It applies to all commercial buildings and residential buildings that are 4 stories or greater. If it is new construction residential, 3 stories or less, it is not eligible for 179D, with the exception of existing building renovations. If a building is 5 years old or older and it's being renovated, any building can pursue 179D. But if it's new construction, it must be 4-story or greater residential or any category of commercial building. So 1-story office is fine, 2-story retail is fine, but residential has to be 4 stories or greater.
Okay, so then, Peter, I think that answers the first part of your question, that multifamily buildings owned by nonprofit, they're eligible as long as they're 4 stories or higher. And then the second part was, are tax benefits only passable to the architecture or engineering firms, or can it be sold to others?
The deduction can only be allocated to one of the designers of the building. So you're limited to just the companies that were designing that property. So typically there's maybe 3 different firms, maybe 4 firms that generally would be eligible, but you cannot sell it to someone that was not a designer of that property.
All right, and then I just got another one. Devin wanted to know, can public building owners request payment or in-kind services in exchange for agreeing to allocate the 179D?
So it depends on the type of entity. Federal agencies typically do not. State, local, or nonprofits oftentimes will have some sort of an exchange in place or a program where there is a request for some form of a payment for that allocation. Generally, that's to then fund their next renovation or some other component. So it is not, most do not do that. However, some do. So that's kind of at the discretion of the government or the nonprofit owner.
Okay, and people must have had their coffee because we got lots of questions recently. Okay, and then I think when you mentioned that multifamily rehabs or renovations, Peter additionally wondered, does this apply to HVAC rehabs, or what kind of is the definition of renovation?
Yeah. So let's advance the slides, and I'll start to weave this together. So there needs to be either new construction property or a renovation to the lighting systems, the HVAC systems, or the building envelope systems to be eligible. So those are the 3 different categories we look for. So quickly, why this has become much more interesting to different types of building owners or engineers or architects. As you can see, a 250,000 square foot school had a benefit of $470,000 of deductions in 22. That same building finishing a year later would be worth 1.34 million in deductions. Okay, next slide. The types of buildings to think about that are great candidates for this, again, commercial building owners. If you're building or you're doing a major renovation of a commercial building and you're doing HVAC or you're doing interior lighting systems, or maybe you're putting a new roof or new glazing on that building, 179D could be a great fit. Government-owned buildings, schools and universities are great. And then 2023 and later, that also includes tribal government buildings as well as nonprofit buildings. Okay, next slide. Okay, again, and who can claim it? This is, again, commercial building owners, architects, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, design build contractors, and then building automation or building controls companies can also be great candidates. And then next slide. Okay, types of buildings. Again, this is really covers that gamut. Federal, state, and local governments. This could be anything from airports to libraries, schools and universities, tribal lands, nonprofits, and commercial buildings. And then next slide. Okay, so this comes back to that question that we got, which was, if it is a renovation, what types of equipment would be good candidates to think about 179D? So heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems. So let's say if it's an existing building that's getting a new chiller plant, new boiler plant, new air handling units, those are great candidates for 179D. New interior lighting systems or daylighting systems, also great candidates. It's worth noting exterior lighting is not included in 179D. Solar panels are not included in 179D. That's would be for separate programs. And then the last category is exterior building envelope systems. So that's roof, windows, insulation systems, etc. Any other questions while we're going through?
We did have one that I don't know if you want to talk about right now. Jennifer was wondering, because of the pass-through, then what is the benefit for the government entity with 179D?
Yeah. Well, in a way, this exists as an incentive to the architecture firm and engineering firm to design a better building, a more energy efficient building. And one of those benefits is that if they're doing that right, and you as the government entity or the nonprofit can reward them with this tax deduction for their work, you're enjoying the energy savings every year that building is in service. Now, there are some entities that have structured plans where they're getting a percentage of that tax deduction to then reinvest in their next renovation or their next sustainability goal, if they have some form of a policy that has monetized it. But there's other entities that just say, look, you engineering firm did an amazing job, went above and beyond. Because of that, we're going to reward you with this. So there's different paths that can be taken specific to how to use this. And again, if you'd like to discuss it further or talk through different scenarios, our emails will be a part of the presentation because there is a lot of nuance to this, and I'm sure there's probably more questions. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So I mentioned the retrofit building pathway. So there's two different paths. Up until the Inflation Reduction Act, there was only traditional 179D, which you have to do an energy model to calculate the energy cost savings. It requires a licensed professional engineer to review and certify those findings and perform a site visit. And it's not something that a firm can self-certify. It has to be an independent third party to do that certification. The Inflation Reduction Act introduced a retrofit building path for older buildings that are at least 5 years old that are undergoing a renovation. And that's the area where low-rise residential can still be eligible to be thinking about this. In general, the benefit scales with the size of the building. So typically, it's something to think about for buildings that are 50,000, 100,000 square feet or more, are some of the best candidates to be considering 179D. And let's go down a couple more slides. Let's skip this one and skip this one. Some of these are going to be in here for everyone as a reference when you're looking back at this. This is another point to touch on. So the safe harbor that exists for 179D in the Inflation Reduction Act says, if you start building your project prior to January 29th of 2023, you're in the safe harbor to get that $5+ per square foot, regardless of paying prevailing wage and apprentices on your project. If you start construction after that date, then you are subject to those rules and requirements. In certain areas that require prevailing wages and apprentices, it's less important. But if your project exists in an area that does not require prevailing wage and apprentice usage, that's something to keep in mind, because you will have potentially $1 per square foot available to your building instead of that $5 per square foot larger benefit. And then if we go down 2 more slides, and there's a summary slide here, right there. Okay, so I'll leave this up on screen, and then I'm happy to answer any other questions that are coming through about 179D applications or usage. But this again is a summary sheet that can be a reference in the future.
All right, well, y'all take a look at that. We got 2 questions that are kind of complementary. Devin wondered, isn't it quid pro quo for a public entity to say we'll sign over the 179D if you pay us a portion of the credit? Well, Cameron was wondering, is it possible for a government entity to require a private company to pay them some of the value of 179D?
So I think the first component is that a government entity or nonprofit does not have to allocate at all. They can always make an election to not allocate to anyone, and they can choose to allocate if they would like to one of the qualifying entities. Generally speaking, some engineering firms or architecture firms can benefit from this, some cannot. So if you were a government entity and required them to claim the benefit, that wouldn't really work, because depending on their tax situation or the entity structure, they may have no use for 179D in the first place. So really it just comes down to the specific details of the situation. Now, federal entities will generally and have policies in place to not request any form of a rebate, but there are several state agencies and local agencies that do, and that's really kind of the nature of how it is. I don't know if that's really the answer you're looking for, but that's kind of directly. I would say that there is no requirement to allocate, and there's no requirement that an engineering firm or architecture firm must take the benefit. Everyone has the option to do it or to not do it.
Interesting, very nuanced. I guess that's why you guys are in business. Devin clarified, even though all the parties can choose to do this, he says he's not comfortable putting in writing that I will do this if I can get this benefit. How do you get around that, or solve for that?
Yeah. So many entities look at this and just say, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to participate in this federal tax deduction, and that's it. And we're not going to ask for anything in exchange, and we're going to keep it simple. Maybe they have concerns about that, or they have concerns of other sorts of fairness or bidding policies, and that's what a lot of nonprofits and government entities do. The vast majority do not have any more advanced policy in place. If you are building a lot of buildings, and this is something that you would make sense to build out a more formalized policy, some larger entities do that, and it's in their advantage to have a more structured policy in place. But if it's something where it's a single building, or the vast majority of government entities and nonprofits are simply allowing an allocation, making an allocation, and that's it.
Okay. Excuse me. There aren't any questions right now, but I'm going to hit the next slide that has, I have your guys' email, Shelby's email, although he's only with us for another week. And then a couple of reminders. That's our email if you have any questions afterwards, like maybe I don't get this up within a week. I'm in a conference next week, so that's possible. And the City Light Energy Advisors, before you start any energy efficiency project, including solar or transportation electrification chargers, give that number a call or email them and make sure that we don't have incentives for you. Okay, still no more questions. Then we're right at 11 o'clock. We ended right on time. Thank you, Mike and Jesse, for being with us today, even though you're in different time zones. And Shelby, I think you're still around. And we will end this right on time. Any parting words? Big nose. All right.
There's a lot of nuance and detail here, and
Oh my
so
gosh.
you can think of this as just the beginning of a conversation. So please feel free to reach out to Mike or myself to talk about this in more detail for your project or whatever you're experiencing in person. But again, thank you very much, everyone. We appreciate the time and look forward to continuing the conversations.
Thank you, everyone. We will hopefully see you in October. Remember to take the survey. Give us your thoughts on what we should bring you next. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Can I hit what?